Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Henry Kankwamba. I'm an Associate Research Fellow in the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you today for this webinar. Today's topic is how should governments respond to crises? So we're going to look at the rapid response analysis using the RIAPA modeling system. This is the third event in the webinar series on the IFPRI modeling systems, informing future pathways and priorities for agri-food systems. This series is co-organized by IFPRI and the CGIAR Initiative on Foresight, and is intended to provide an overview of some of the tools that we use to look at various aspects of the future of food systems. During this webinar, our presenters will demonstrate how the RIAPA modeling system is being used to analyze impacts of different crises and also inform how policy should be implemented and should be guided. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Our opening remarks will be made by Chris Hilbrunner. Chris is the Division Chief in the Foresight Analysis and Learning at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security in the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And our presentations today are going to be first made by Dr. James Thurlow. James is our Division Director, Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit here at IFPRI. And the second part of the presentation will be made by Dr. Shenshin Diao. And Shenshin is a Senior Research Fellow in the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit. Our discussant is going to be Dr. Keith Webb, who is also a Senior Research Fellow in the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit. And he is also a lead on the CGIAR Research Initiative on Foresight. Having said that, and before I hand over to Chris for the opening remarks, I want to share a few notes on how we'll proceed. So the presentation will last for about 25 to 30 minutes, with the rest of the time dedicated to questions and answers. So please feel free to send your questions via the Q&A window at any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. So when you ask your question, please also let us know who you are, where you're from, and what organization you represent. And finally, for your own information, we are recording the webinar and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event. And with that, over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Henry. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's able to join us today. As Henry mentioned, my name is Chris Hilbrunner, and I'm the Division Chief for Analysis, Data, and Learning in USAID's Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. And very excited to be here today to discuss IFPRI's rapid response analysis. So one key role of the team that I manage here within USAID is to understand both how the world is changing and what those changes mean for the investments that USAID makes in food security. And two key examples of recent shocks that we've grappled with have been COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in both cases, IFPRI modeling has helped USAID and I think the broader community to better understand the implications of these shocks and how to prioritize response. So turning first to COVID, this was the first example, I think, of a really close collaboration between the analytics team that I work with at USAID and IFPRI's modeling unit. And as I think most of us can remember, particularly during that first year of COVID, everything was in flux. It was really hard to find high quality, thoughtful assessment of how the pandemic might affect poverty and food security. For very good reasons, the focus was very much on the health impacts of the pandemic. And so the IFPRI modeling was really, for us, the first really tangible and rigorous analysis that we saw on the way households were being impacted by the pandemic, sort of above and beyond, those immediate health concerns. And I think the unique contribution of the analysis in the context of COVID was the degree to which they were really able to highlight these economic impacts, both in terms of the scale of the economic impacts, but some of the important nuance about how and why different populations were being affected in different ways. 2 years later, there was another shock to the global food system when Russia invaded Ukraine. And again, we worked closely with IFPRI to ramp up their country modeling. And this time, that modeling looked not only at the potential impacts of the invasion on household well-being, but it also looked at a series of policy responses, potential policy responses, including cash transfers and a series of fertilizer-related interventions, and then estimated the degree to which these interventions might mitigate the impacts we were anticipating on poverty, hunger, and diets. And this analysis, including this addition of the policy analysis, were heavily used by USAID. We were fortunate at USAID to receive roughly $1 billion in Ukraine supplemental funds from Congress. And the analyses that IFPRI provided played a central role in informing both how these funds were distributed geographically and how those funds were focused in terms of the types of programming that we ultimately supported. In addition to informing some of this decision-making about resources, the analyses also really helped to shape some of the key ways that we thought about these crises. One thing I alluded to earlier that I think bears repeating is, this modeling really helped to emphasize both the scale and the persistence of the COVID-19 pandemic impacts on households. Even once we were in the second year of looking at the Ukraine invasion impacts, you could really see that the persistence of the COVID-19 impacts was really continuing to have, in some cases, the largest effect on poverty, malnutrition, and diets in the countries we were concerned about. So that was one really key takeaway. The other one was that I think in doing this modeling, it helped us really understand and appreciate some of the broader context that was driving the higher prices that we saw in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion, and particularly understanding that those drivers were not just the invasion. So, for example, highlighting the role of Chinese fertilizer export restrictions on global prices. So really helping us, again, have this more nuanced understanding of what was driving the impacts on food security that we were seeing. So why have these analyses been so useful to us? I'd want to highlight, I think, 3 key characteristics that I think have contributed to their uptake within USAID and I think with other partners. The first is that IFPRI's modeling system covers a large number of low and lower middle income countries. I think something like 80% of the world's global poor population is included in the modeling system. And this ability to look both in depth at individual countries, but also be able to look across a wide range of countries has been really useful and really important to us. Second, the modeling system not only can ingest multiple shocks, so it can look at COVID, it can look at the invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, but it also estimates multiple outcomes. So it can estimate poverty, it can estimate economic growth, it can estimate impacts on diets, it can estimate impacts on employment. And particularly in the context of an initiative like Feed the Future that has multiple interlinked priorities, this ability to look at different facets of household well-being has been really critical. And then finally, I think the communication of the modeling results has been very effective. A combination of slide decks and webinars and briefing papers. And I think that this very clear and succinct and intuitive communication of modeling results has helped to build a lot of confidence and promote use among a wider range of stakeholders. So altogether, I think that IFPRI's capacity to conduct this rapid response modeling has really grown and evolved, particularly over the last 5 years. And I think it's become one of a handful of really trusted resources that we turn to when major shocks occur. So in order to provide a bit of a deeper dive into this work, I will hand this over to James.
Thanks, Chris. Just share my slides. Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much, and thanks for that build up to the work that we're going to present today. As Henry said, this is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've been running to give people an introduction to the IFPRI modeling systems. And so far to date, we've looked at webinars. We've had webinars that look at the long-term implications of climate change and agricultural productivity growth using our global impact model. We've also looked at prioritizing policies investments over the medium term using RIAPA. And today we're going to look at how we also use RIAPA to look at the very immediate effects of crises and to some extent policy reforms. Xinshen will come to that later. So what Xinshen and I are going to do is give you an overview, a feel for some of the modeling work that we've done that Chris has alluded to, and hopefully give you a feel for why this kind of analysis is quite useful and provides those insights that Chris mentioned. So I know this is the fourth webinar, and I know some of you may have already attended the webinar where we discussed or described the RIAPA modeling system. But for those of you who haven't, let me give you a very quick overview. This is a country data and modeling system, so country level analysis. And on the left-hand side, you can see that it's not just a single model, it's actually a system of linked models. And at the heart of RIAPA, right, is this dynamic economy-wide model that captures, as the name suggests, the entire economy, all the sectors, all the households, the government within a particular economy, allowing us to look at how their future trajectories are impacted by shocks and policy changes. The second key feature or component are those micro simulation models in the bottom right in the green box that allow us to track household level outcomes, which Chris has just mentioned. So why do we want an economy-wide model? Well, in the middle panel, you can see how this allows us to capture broader agri-food systems, right? Agri-food systems go well beyond just primary agriculture, which is the gray box there, but includes agro-processing and traders and food services and input suppliers. All of these actors and sectors make up the broader agri-food system. And in the bar charts in the middle, you can see that even in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, it's true that agriculture, the gray bars, continue to dominate. These are shares of the overall agri-food system. Those gray bars, primary agriculture, continues to dominate, but those off-farm components of the agri-food system are crucially important, making up at least a third of the overall agri-food system, even in low-income countries. So we want a model that can capture both primary agriculture, the broader agri-food system, as well as its linkages to the broader economy at the national level. As Chris mentioned, and it really is thanks to sustained support from USAID, from the Gates Foundation, and from the CGIAR, the donors that contribute to the CGIAR, it's only thanks to their financial support that we've been able to build out and maintain a large country coverage. You can imagine it takes time and effort and resources to build a model for each of these countries. And you can see at this point, and this number continues to grow, we're already capturing 3/4 of the developing world's populations, and we're capturing over 85% of the of the world's poor population. And so this allows us to cover those countries and to have these models ready on the shelf when the crisis happens, so that we can take them off the shelf and conduct the analysis and respond as quickly as possible. One more slide, two key features of the model. One more slide on the model. So on the left-hand side, the key thing here is we're tracking agri-food supply chains. We're actually tracking all the supply chains in the economy. And what this means then is that if there's a shock to a very particular primary agricultural sector, and you can see on the left-hand side of this bar chart all the detailed commodities and sectors, subsectors that make up the agricultural sector in each and every model, we can track how a shock to these primary agricultural sectors ripples along supply chains through the linked processing sectors and out into the broader economy, and ultimately to the final consumer or the export market, whichever it may be. And so this detail that's inside the model allows us to track the spillover effects of shocks in different commodity markets, in different economic sectors. On the left-hand side, you can see a key feature, as I mentioned before, this ability to track household-level outcomes. We do this in two ways. Firstly, inside the economy-wide model, we've taken the entire population and we've broken them up into population groups. And you can see here in this little illustration, we've separated in the red box, rural quintiles and urban quintiles, right? In reality, the models have more detail than that. Each of these population groups is constructed in the model using data from a household survey on their income and expenditure patterns. And what that means then is that when we observe changes in commodity consumption and prices inside the economy-wide model, we can take that information back down to the micro-simulation model, to the survey, where we can look at how those changes impact each and every household that responded to the survey. And we can ultimately recalculate their level of consumption of different food groups and in total. And we can compare that to standard poverty lines, to healthy reference diets, to calorie requirement thresholds, and report on things like poverty, diet quality, and undernourishment. Right? So this ability to report household level outcomes is key. And actually, Shen is going to spend more time in the presentation talking about the details of our results at the household level. So now over to the actual crisis analysis. Our objective for this, I'm going to present some results from one of the exercises that we did together with USAID using these models. And the focus of this exercise was to use the models for about 20 developing countries. And we looked at the overlapping effects of 3 concurrent global crises or overlapping crises. So the first crisis was COVID-19, which peaked during 2020 and 2021, although as Chris said, its effects lingered far beyond that. We then overlay on top of that the spike in world prices that occurred in 2022 as a result of the war in Ukraine. And then the third crisis on top of that was the global slowdown in 2023. We conducted this analysis early in 2023, but already we were expecting the slowdown to take place. So we're going to look at 3 scenarios, 3 questions. What was COVID's economic effect, including the effects of lockdowns and social distancing? Secondly, how did rising food, fuel, and fertilizer prices affect local markets, local consumers, local producers? And then in 2023, what was the impact of falling world export prices because of weaker global demand, or weakening global demand, and rising world import prices when the dollar was strengthening? What was its impacts on food systems and food security? So in the panel on the right, you can see some of the information that we use, that we put into the RIAPA model. Right? So you can see here in the top panel, changes in GDP per capita by sector during those peak COVID years, 2020, 2021. And you can see the gray bar, which is what we expected countries to grow at prior to COVID-19, so in December 2019. And you can see on the left-hand side, we thought economies were going to grow, these 20 economies would grow on average by about 2.6%, again in per capita terms. But in reality, in 2020, what actually happened, the green bars, is that these economies contracted by 3.2%, right? So an almost 5% swing over that period. You can see to the right that most of that decline was driven by industry and by services. And actually, agriculture maintained its growth relative to expectations, at least in 2020. But in 2021, when we started to see signs of recovery in industry and services, that's when agriculture started to contract, in part because of the seasonal nature of agriculture, in an inherent delay in agricultural effects. So we're going to take these shocks at the broad sector level, plus information that we collected together with partners on what was happening at the subsector level, and we're going to feed this information into the RIAPA model. We're also in 2022 going to start to introduce the impacts in world prices. That's in the lower panel in the figure. And you can see here the dramatic increase in prices that took place from December 2019, the beginning of our analysis, all the way through to the end of 2022. You can see that world fertilizer prices, the third bar, increased by almost 300% over this period. And although by the end of November, the diamond, by the end of November 2022, prices had started to fall again, they were still 160% above our initial levels at the end of December. So we're going to take impacts on these world prices, these changes in world prices, import and export prices, and we're going to impose them on the model and see how they affect the economy and welfare. So before I present results, let me just quickly give you an analysis, the timeline of the work that we're about to see. So as Chris said, early on in 2020, we immediately went into action to start analyzing the broader impacts of COVID-19 on food systems and food security. Now, at that time, markets were breaking down, right? Lockdowns were causing markets to completely cease, and in some cases, cease to function. Think of food services and restaurants in many countries under lockdown. And so our market-based economy, which is what RIAPA is, perhaps wasn't quite as useful in that initial context, those first few months of COVID. And so we switched over to an old school method called SAM multiplier analysis, social accounting matrix multiplier analysis, which allowed us to mimic the effects of those market closures. Secondly, we also drew heavily, and I think I want to stress this throughout this presentation, that we drew heavily on our IFPRI country programs and on our national partners who compiled the information that we needed on what was happening at the detailed sector level. Think about those early days as the information was coming in and lockdown policies were being implemented very, very rapidly. It really took on-the-ground presence and local partner knowledge to be able to tell us what was happening on a daily basis. In 2022, early on in 2022, we switched focus to looking at those world food prices. And here, because this was a market shock, we really did switch back to using our RIAPA models to estimate the immediate effects, economic impacts of the crisis. Again, it was surprising how little information we had on fertilizer use by crop in countries. And so how could we needed to draw again on our IFPRI country programs to compile the evidence on what we thought the impacts of fertilizer prices could mean at the crop level. And then in 2023, we moved over to look by basically the end of 2022 and into early 2023, we were looking at the effects of concurrent crises, multiple crises on top of each other. That's what I'm going to present, or Shinshan and I are going to present today. And then finally, I should mention, because in the description of this event, we talked about looking at the effects of El Nino in Africa and some of the work we've done this year together with Malawi's National Planning Commission. I'm afraid due to time constraints, we're not going to be able to look at that today, but I'm going to point you towards this seminar, which goes into our results in detail. So just very quickly, we're going to present some results on the next few slides. And in this box here, I'm just explaining how to interpret them. So as I said, we're going to start with a baseline scenario, the black line, which is what we expected growth to be prior to COVID. In the figure, we're looking at changes in the poverty headcount, and you can see we expected poverty to keep declining during this period based on pre-COVID expectations. We're then going to overlay on top of that the effects of COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021. And then in 2022, that spike in world prices. And then finally in 2023, the global economic slowdown. And so we're going to show results at the end of 2023, the deviation between the black baseline expectations and the modeled impact, which is the gray bar, once we've got all three of these crises overlaid on top of each other. So I'm going to just talk about the results on the broader economy. And you can see here, in our modeling analysis, economies across the board contracted as a result of this triple crisis. And on the figure here, this is how we're going to be presenting all the results until the end of the presentation. So let me just quickly tell you how to interpret it. As we saw in the previous slide, we're measuring the impacts at the end of 2023. And so in the case of Bangladesh, we can see that by the end of 2023, the national GDP, or national income, was 1% below expectations, below that black baseline scenario. You can also see which of the three crises mainly contributed. to that economic slowdown or the economic contraction. And you can see in the case of Bangladesh, it was overwhelmingly COVID that caused the economy to contract. And that's actually true across all countries. What's also evident is that the size of impacts varies dramatically across countries based on their level of exposure, based on their lockdown policies, and based on their economic structure. And so you can see big impacts in countries like Cambodia, relatively speaking, and relatively smaller impacts in countries like Sudan and DRC. On the right-hand side, you can see of the panel, you can see the impacts on agri-food system GDP, the agriculture, the processing, the traders, and so on that I mentioned earlier. And you can see, generally speaking, there's a close relationship compared to national GDP, that in most countries, the GDP losses in the food system were smaller than the GDP losses in the overall economy. And that was primarily because it was industry and services, most of which is outside the food system, that were the most adversely affected during COVID. In fact, in some countries, we actually saw workers moving back to agriculture because it was providing effectively a social safety net for the overall economy. Overall, you can see in this analysis, and this is the take home, is that it was really COVID that was driving most of the impacts, at least in terms of national income, national GDP, and impacts on incomes within the agri-food system. I'm now going to turn over to Shinshen, who's going to show a very different story at the household level.
Thanks, James. As James said earlier, RIAPA is a system of models. So the economy-wide model that James just presented actually a link to a micro simulation model, which can allow us to use the entire national representative household survey data to assess the impact at household level. This household level impact, we focus on 3 development indicators: poverty impact, hunger/food security impact, and diet quality impact. I start from poverty impact. So we see, if we remember what James said, so the economy among these 20 countries have attracted a lot during these 3 crises, but it's mainly affected by COVID. So if we remember correctly, it's almost 80% impact is from COVID for the economy. However, here we see the impact from COVID, even though it's still dominating, but it's become smaller. It's slightly more than half of impact actually is from COVID, if we put all 20 countries together. The reason is when world prices increase due to the war and due to global economy slowdown, actually the price impact start to kick in more than income effect. For many poor households, they are very sensitive to the rising price. So the poverty impact is measured by $2.14 per day international poverty level. So from some point of view, even though poverty is measured by income, however, the real expenditure actually is a result of poverty change. So we see the poverty in total actually increased about almost 30 million, 26 million in 2022, and then eventually, if we consider the early global slowdown in 2023, we expect the increase further to 28.7. That is a comparison without all these 3 crises. So also we see between rural impact is dominant, is more than 80%. It's not because rural is more affected. That is mainly because rural poverty is predominated rural phenomena in many countries. We also see the variation across countries. So now we see the green bar in each country start to become smaller if we remember what we saw from James' previous slides. taking Cambodia as an example. So now still green bar is quite large, but it's much smaller than before. Cambodia is a country actually heavily depend on global value chain for its garment industry, footwear industry. That's why their GDP contracts a lot during COVID period. However, for the poor, many of them, they may not be actually part of a global value chain. That's why the impact become relatively smaller. Let's turn to the hunger impact. Poverty is measured by international dollar 2.14 per day. Hunger is measured by calorie. So we can think about hunger as a food security issue directly to individual households. So the rising hunger number looks smaller. That's not because the impact on hunger is smaller. It's in the base, the number of hunger people actually is less than number of poverty people. It's not everybody they are poor, they also cannot pay their basic consumption for their basic need calorie. But still, the number is alarming. We are talking about 15 million people among these 20 countries will become undernourished due to this crisis. If we look at the distribution impact among three crises, again, COVID is still dominated, even slightly more than poverty impact, now reached from before it's 52, 53, now it's 55%. However, the impact of world prices actually become relatively larger. So also, if we look at rural-urban distribution, even though rural still dominated, remember in the poverty impact is about 80%. Now we are talking about 77%. Means for urban people, since they all pay their, since they purchase all their food from market, the price sensitivity is much larger than the income effect. Again, if we look at country variation, we see still for many countries, COVID is a dominating factor. But for some countries like Cambodia, actually we see COVID impact become further smaller. The reason is for Cambodia, people who are actually undernourished index line and actually may not be that much sensitive to COVID. So the cross-country variation actually are affected by two factors. One is their distribution of hunger people versus the distribution of poverty people. Secondly is their economic structure, like James mentioned. Now we move on to the last indicator we use it to measure. This is an indicator less actually often overlooked when we talk about household impact. That is diet quality. So we are talking about more and more countries are moving from extremely low income to low middle income country. Therefore, it's not just calorie matters, it's their diet quality, diet structure matters. So we use reference diet deprivation index to measure diet quality. Basically, we are talking about the household consumption structure across 6 major food groups. It's not just simply calorie, it's what kind of calorie you consume. So we basically compare the household's actual consumption pattern with a healthy diet consumption pattern. So when the gap increase between household actual consumption and this healthy diet food expenditure structure, we call actually diet quality getting worse. So means increase the index number is actually means households are moving away from a healthy diet. So the bar pie chart basically show the distribution of different crises on the diet quality impact. Diet quality indeed worsened due to 3 crises. So since it's an index, we don't use people's number to measure it. So we didn't really show how many people they are actually move away from a healthy diet. So we focus on the distribution. Again, COVID impact is relatively large, even larger than impact on hunger. That's obviously for people, actually, they are relatively less poor. They may actually can consume basic calorie once they are affected by any crisis through their income falling or facing higher prices. The first thing, they reduce consumption of some less necessary healthy goods. So therefore, COVID impact dominated by income impact. We can see COVID impact start to increase. And then on another side, we also see the economy slowdown impact getting larger. Again, come to country distribution, we see the patterns start to become different from a hunger. Means for middle income country like Cambodia, the diet quality impact become much larger. Over there, maybe a few people are under hunger line, but many people, their diet structure actually is a little bit far away from healthy diet structure. Given the time, let's turn to the summary for our general finding. So like James said, the analysis actually is done at the individual country level. We have done 20 plus countries analysis. We present in the way like a global study. Actually, we have a 20 country study. We have a detailed, in-depth country data, close relationship, working relationship, collaboration with the country team. So even though we are talking about global crisis, we see the impact on the poverty, on the food security. We are talking about if without this crisis, actually, we are talking about poor people, actually, the number of the poor increase, the poverty increase, means the gain of poverty reduction before COVID, we are going to lose about 2 to 3 years, this kind of gain. Considering increase in population, the absolute number of poor people definitely will be higher today than without all of this crisis. However, if we do not go to this kind of household level analysis, if we only focus on economy analysis, like GDP analysis, we may overstate the COVID impact. Indeed, COVID impact on economy is much, much larger. We are talking about more than 80% impact come from COVID. For the poverty analysis, actually, it emphasized not just COVID, actually later crisis from world prices increase, from global economic slowdown will continue affect poor people, as we are going to see. Looking forward, we are thinking about actually RIAPA, since it's a tool to respond such a rapid policy issue and crisis issue. So we are actually now in the process to work with country team for their current policy challenges. The recent current policy challenges are often at national level, even though it's related to the previous crisis from COVID, from world prices increase, especially from expected global economic slowdown. So we especially in Africa country, more and more countries are now facing mounting foreign and domestic debt. So their macroeconomic instability issue become a new challenge. So for many of these countries, governments are facing a dilemma. On the one side, the policy reform for many delayed policies actually are urgent, such like exchange rate policy, fuel subsidy, and especially the revenue base they are too narrow for many countries. On the other side, when the global economy slow down, when the country economy growth is slowed down, so countries also are facing a very hard political and social economic actually environment. Like of jobs, especially like our good jobs among youth, are often actually is a factor you have to take into account for any policy reform. So because of this background, we are asked by many countries' government to actually provide more such a rapid policy modeling analysis, to provide even this, especially to provide trade-off for any policies reform they are in the consideration. We are working with Kenya and Rwanda country team and a country partner, including government partner, for their consideration of tax reform. In Nigeria, we know the country already has lifted food subsidy and is in the process to make foreign exchange rate floor. And then in this process, the inflation become a pressure. Therefore, we are asked by the government actually to help them assess the additional policy reform. For example, they want to reduce tariff on some green import. So how we are going to deal with inflation pressure, and that also calls for security concern. In Ethiopia, the currency devaluation is in the process. What's the potential impact? Actually, it can affect the economy and especially affect the country's poverty and food security situation. So therefore, the policy response is not just the RIAPA team's modeling work, it's beyond modeling. So as James mentioned, even in all of this crisis analysis, we have worked closely with country team. So now this close working relationship become more urgent once the policy challenge come from country. So we work closely with our IFPRI country programs, with our national partners. In the meantime, with past 4 years work and ongoing work, the demand for us to transfer the modeling capacity, the modeling toolkits to the country become increasingly important and urgent. We are also in the process to work with our country program teams and the national partners to continue such capacity building and tool and the modeling kit transfer process. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, James, and Shinshin, and to everyone in the audience for listening. Now we'll have the opportunity to hear some questions that are on the audience's minds. And just to get us going, I will start the ball rolling. So my question goes to all the presenters. Please feel free to pick my question. So the presentation focuses on measuring impacts of crisis, but the seminar title refers to government responses. How has IFPRI's modeling informed policy decisions by governments? I know you have said a lot of things, but as in brief, how has IFPRI's modeling informed policy decisions by governments? Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can take that. Thanks, Henry, and thanks everyone for your questions in the Q&A. It's true. The title was a bit misleading. We said we would look at policy responses, and we actually just ended up focusing on the methods for measuring impacts. But the work was used to do for policy responses. Chris has already talked about how the US government used some of the analysis on the Ukraine to think about how to allocate resources across different countries in order to respond to the crisis. There also, particularly in the case of the Ukraine spike in world prices and a big focus on fertilizer, there was quite a lot of concern within our national governments to think about how best to cushion the impact of those higher fertilizer prices on farmers. And so in countries like Kenya and elsewhere, governments were using the analysis to think through what their response should be, such as reducing, subsidizing fertilizer imports during that peak period when farmers were making planting decisions and ensuring that the fertilizer was available. So as Chris said, we looked at a range of different policy interventions, from social protection, cash transfers, to things like fertilizer use efficiency, to try and stretch the fertilizer that was available further for farmers, as well as providing subsidies. And overall, the fertilizer use efficiency, although a medium-term solution or sort of a 1 to 2 year solution, was one that paid out a bit more than the others. Happy to share the results of those with anyone. Thanks. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you, James, for that response. So we also have a question here from one of the participants named Aristide. He's from Cameroon, and he works as a technical engineer in the crop sector. So his question is, are countries that are in Central Africa and generally French-speaking countries included in the RIAPA system? Do you cover some countries in Central Africa and also generally of the French-speaking community?
Well, to some extent, we go where there is interest, and one source of interest is USAID. So not to put Chris on the spot as to why there are not more Central African economies in USAID's portfolio or the Gates Foundation. But we do have, let me first start with your second point, we do have a number of Francophone countries. We have Senegal, we have Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and so on. So it's not a Francophone situation. We do have countries like the DRC and others, although perhaps that's Southern Africa. But one of the things that we do struggle with is the access or the availability of the kind of information that we need to build these models. And so while we're increasingly trying to add new countries to the suite of RIAPA models that we have, there is always this bar that has to be crossed, which is a minimum level of information. So Aristide, more than happy to discuss with you bilaterally, if you want to send me an email, sort of what the data requirements would be to get one of these models up and running. It has been done in the past, and it could be done again in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, James, for that response. We also have a question from Jessica, and Jessica is asking whether, since one of the crises we've recently faced is conflict, so in modeling these crises, have you accounted for availability of conflict in some of the countries that we are studying? And if so, how did you account for availability of a conflict?
Yeah, maybe I pick up this question. Actually, we have IFPRI has country program in Sudan and also in Myanmar. So both countries are now in a conflict. So indeed, it's a challenge when the countries are in conflict, how we are going to keep our actually work continually doing in this country. It's hard to actually to have our staff continue to be in the country. However, the work actually is continue in both countries. So the modeling work is relatively less dependent on in-country actually data collection. Still, we manage actually to have our local partner in both countries to work with them actually to take into account the conflict in our analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I mean, there's also, so thanks, Jason, it's a really good question. It's actually one that we struggled with quite a bit because although we were looking at the triple crisis, many countries were facing their own national crises, and it included both conflict and also think about the Horn of Africa, the ongoing drought, and what that was doing to, say, the Ethiopian economy and food security. It was a decision that we made to focus on just the 3 crises and not at this point when we were doing the analysis to add more crises. But subsequent to that, we have been looking for particular countries at their unique conflict and climate situation. And so I apologize again for leading you astray and not presenting some of the El Nino work from Malawi, because that would be a good example of how, on top of the crises that Malawi faced, it has also been facing quite severe effects from El Nino this year. And last. So yeah, thanks.
We have, thank you, Shinshin and James. We also have another question here from Noreen. So Noreen is wondering that we have presented the results for different outcomes and also along different value chains and so on. However, she's at sea as to what are the data sources for these incredible analyses.
So, there are 2 main data sources. Let me just summarize it like this, and I can talk about Kenya in particular if that helps, but it's true for all of the countries. So the main source of information we have, and there's been a number of questions about using GDP versus alternative measures, but the main data source we have, for good or for worse, are countries' national accounts, basically the system of national accounts that estimates countries' GDP by sector and builds it up. So that's one of the key data sources, something that we call a supply use table. And Kenya has one produced by its national accountant, who's our main collaborator in building these models. The second is a national household survey, because we want those micro-simulation models to be able to track poverty. And so unfortunately, a survey like DHS, while incredibly valuable and a crucial source of information, is not adequate for building a model like RIAPA. What we need is an income and expenditure survey, think a diary, where you're asking households, how did you earn your income, but more importantly, how did you spend it? Which commodities did you consume at the household level? Over the last month or year, and so on. So those are the 2 main data sources, national accounts and a supply use table on the one hand, and a big national household survey. The LSMS ISA surveys, which many of you may be aware of, and the Gates Foundation is investing, is extremely useful for us to understand and get data for the agricultural sector, but typically the samples are too small for national poverty analysis unless it's all that's available. We like to use, where possible, the official national household surveys, which I think in Kenya is KIHBS, the Kenyan Integrated Household Budget Survey. Thanks very much.
To be brief on time and also account for as many questions as possible, I'm going to ask about 3 questions. So listen carefully to all the panelists. So the second question is, most of the crises that you're discussing are global in nature. And IFPRI already has a global model. Why are you using a specific country model to address issues that are affecting like the entire global community, like the entire regions and the like, instead of using the IFPRI global model? Second, we are in a space of where AI is taking over everything, and very soon, most of the other fields are now AI-driven. How is IFPRI positioning itself to use AI in these modeling initiatives to address these crises? The last question, there's a big drive towards localization and investing in partners' capabilities to respond to their own needs. How is IFPRI making sure that its models and tools are getting into the hands of local researchers and governments? Because sometimes you just go to a country and present these fancy models, but then within the country, there's nobody who can use them. So how is IFPRI making sure that the models are getting into the hands of the local partners? Thank you.
Okay, I can have a crack because time is short. Why didn't we use a global model? Well, the truth is we did use global models early on in the COVID pandemic, and I think we were sort of amongst the first out the gate to provide some global estimates of poverty and food insecurity and so on. Really important numbers for moving the global debate. But when it comes to the country level, we want to have more detail on agri-food systems, on poverty, on household characteristics, and so on. And that's really where these country models come to the fore. So it's really a swings and roundabouts. You win in terms of detail and detailed on households and the economy. You lose because you are less able with country models to capture the spillovers between countries. So we have to be quite careful in making sure this is the right tool for the task. In the examples we've given, we think they are, but there's certainly some cases where a global model is the better tool. Not sure if any others want to take some of the other questions.
I can respond to the one on making sure that we're sharing capacity. Excellent question. As some have already noted, we do have demand from country partners. It's important not only to get the tools and the capacity to where it's needed, but also because that improves the analysis with the local expertise and the relevance to local concerns. We do this in several ways. One is by improving the documentation we have of the data and modeling tools we use. Secondly, making them more accessible so that others can use them. Thirdly, we realize that sometimes access itself is not sufficient, so we offer training programs, particularly focused on partners. And finally, through joint work, through collaborative research that provides opportunities for hands-on learning, and in the process, as I noted, improves the analysis that we do to make sure it's timely and relevant. Thanks.
Henry, in the interest of time, I can try and answer some of the questions in the chat if that helps, and then we can sort of make sure we try and end on time. Thanks.
That's right. So 1 minute, James, if you can crack all of them within the shortest possible time.
Will do. So I think we can pull to Keith. Thanks.
Oh, James, you're saying you'll answer those online as opposed to...
I will.
Yeah.
Yes, I will.
Okay,
Thanks.
excellent. Well, so thank you, everyone. Thanks, and particularly Henry, Chris, James, and Shin. It's great to see this application of modeling to near real-time policy challenges that we know are really high on the agenda of policymakers. As noted, this brings us to the conclusion of our webinar series on informing future pathways and priorities for agri-food systems. James mentioned, we've had a webinar on climate impacts, on agricultural productivity growth, on prioritization, and today on rapid response to crises. Some of you may have joined all 4 of those webinars, and to you, a gold medal. Congratulations. If you haven't, no worries. They've been recorded and will be available online if you'd like to listen to them or go back and hear them again. The webinars have covered a wide range of topics, tools, and scales from here and now to global and farther in the future. But what they have in common is a systematic approach to exploring questions about agri-food systems that are complex and interconnected, and the choices that need to be made. And as Chris Hilberner noted, even when, and perhaps especially when, conditions are uncertain and information is incomplete. In those conditions, models help us to explore these questions and choices under alternative possible futures, not to predict the future, certainly not to determine the future, but rather to better understand the implications of different possible pathways in the future so that we can inform the choices that we make today. To be useful, models can't operate in isolation, but they need to be part of a process of dialogue and engagement with those who are in a position to make choices that affect the future of agri-food systems. In this process of analysis and engagement, we're fortunate to be able to collaborate with a large network of partners, including colleagues across the CGIAR and in research and policy advisory institutions around the world, including in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. IFPRI's modeling work is part of a larger CGIAR initiative on Foresight, and that work and collaboration will continue to grow as part of a new CGIAR research portfolio from 2025 onwards. So we invite you to stay tuned as that new portfolio is developed in the coming months. Meanwhile, thanks very much for your interest, for joining the webinar today and others in the webinar series, and please do keep in touch. Cheers.